It's an interesting place to visit, and it's the reason my book starts there is because it's where Shelley is buried and where Keats is buried, and we all know that. That's sort of, they're the famous people who are buried there. But when I went to the Protestant Cemetery in 2006, I realised something which I'd only sort of read about, which is that in fact both of them are buried next to a friend. Keats is buried next to Seven, who was the artist who travelled with him to Rome and who looked after him during his final illness. And Shelley is buried next to someone called Edward Trelawney, who was a sort of strange Cornish adventurer who arrived in Pisa in the last year of Shelley's life. And I was rather struck by these sort of shared graves, and by the thought that even in death, Shelley and Keats are buried next to men who seem content to remain in their shadows. And that got me thinking about friendship and about the relationship between the famous and their friends. And that's why I decided to start the book there. Well, the twin axes of my book are Shelley and Hunt. But both Shelley and Hunt live as part of a complicated family network. Shelley lives with his wife Mary and Mary's stepsister Claire, and for much of the time Hunt lives with his wife Marianne and Marianne's sister Bess. And it's by looking at the lives of people like Claire and Bess that you sort of see a darker side of these romantic stories about free love and idealism and politics, because it's women who are at the margins of the group who really suffer the consequences of the ideals much more acutely. And not only those women, but others, when you widen out your camera angle and you look at figures who have sort of fallen off the edge of history, you begin to see the group as much more fluid, and the gender dynamics are much more fluid than you might otherwise realise. Well, that was one of the things I really wanted to try and bring out, was how young they all were. So at the point at which Shelley and Mary and Claire eloped to France, Mary and Claire are both 16 years old. By the time Mary Shelley is 21, she's already become a wife and a mother and a novelist. And the sort of intensity of the group's communal existence was something I thought was very fascinating. And you can see that at every turn. You can see that in the Swiss summer of 1816, when they tell ghost stories and Mary Shelley starts Frankenstein. And you can see that in places like the Marlow summer of 1817, when the Shelleys and the Hunts decamp to a large house in Marlow and go on boating expeditions and picnics and live together in this quite intense communal way. But you can also see that in just small things like a dinner party where a huge argument erupts about Christianity, and where the painter Benjamin Haydon is baited into sort of oblivion by Shelley and Hunt, who tell him things like, they say Shakespeare was an atheist, and he writes enraged diary accounts of this. But you can also see it in the sonnet writing competitions between Keats and Shelley and Hunt, and between other people in the group, which produce sonnets like Ozymandias, written in 15 or 20 minutes, just for fun, which I find fascinating. And you can see it in the arguments that Hunt and Hazlitt had about Napoleon. And at one point, Keats describes how, in a letter to somebody else, how the web of our life was of mingled yarn, and how everyone's at loggerheads, he says in a letter to one of his friends. So that shows you that it's extremely creative and inspiring living as part of this group, but that it also can be extremely fraught, and that when you've got so many creative types, then tempers are going to flare. Frankenstein, as I said, comes out of that Swiss summer of 1816, and Mary Shelley writes about how its genesis is in an evening where she and Shelley and Byron sit around telling ghost stories. And after that summer, Mary Shelley then writes her first draft, and then Shelley comes on board as editor. And if you look at the manuscripts of Frankenstein, you can see right through Shelley's annotations in the margins, changing things, tweaking things. And I'm very interested in that, because I think it in some way, lots of ways, shows the best of romantic collaborative creativity. It shows Shelley working as a generous and incisive editor, bringing out the best things about his wife's text. It really shows romantic sociability at its most productive and its most creative. And Mary Shelley celebrates that in her own writings about the novel. And I've always found it intriguing that a novel which is about the dangers of isolation, which is about the dangers of egotism, should have been written in this intensely collaborative, creative context. Mary Shelley describes it having come out of many a walk and many a drive and many a conversation. And I think it's both illumination that should be the case, and that she should choose to describe it like that. One of the things that intrigued me is I wanted to understand why the idea of the solitary romantic wins over the course of the 19th century, why Leigh Hunt's vision of sociable romanticism seems to die a sort of quiet and unmourned death. And that has a lot to do with the competition that starts after the deaths of Shelley and Keats and Byron about the way in which the past should be memorialised, and about whether individual poets should be memorialised as part of a group or as what Matthew Arnold described as sort of ineffectual angel, these ethereal figures removed from their society. And of course that's what wins. So the story of the afterlife is, I think, rather interesting, because it sort of tells us a bit about why Romanticism has become sort of synonymous with isolated creativity and with the image of the isolated genius.